In this lecture, we will look at some of the technical options that we can implement for monitoring. Usually, operating systems come with bundled monitoring tools. If we use Windows servers, we will get Performance Monitor. We can configure the Performance Monitor counters to measure the processor, memory, and input and output performance. SQL Server itself also comes with many bundled monitoring tools. The first one we will look at is SQL Server Profiler. SQL Server Profiler is graphical and very user-friendly. We can use SQL Server Profiler to capture live events for monitoring and troubleshooting. The captured events can then be replayed in another environment for further investigation. For instance, if we cannot do extensive monitoring and troubleshooting in a production environment, then we can capture live events in a production environment, then replay the captured events in a test environment for further investigation. When we use SQL Server Profiler to investigate slow-running queries, we would capture the events listed here, especially those highlighted in bold. We can find SQL Server Profiler on the top menu of SQL Server Management Studio under Tools. SQL Server Extended Events is a relatively new monitoring tool. It's more efficient. We can use SQL Server Extended Events to monitor the internal working of SQL Server. We can also configure SQL Server Extended Events to take an action in response to some events. So it's very flexible and powerful. Eventually, SQL Server Extended Events will replace SQL Server Profiler. This is an example of using extended events for monitoring. On this screen, we select the events we want to monitor. On this screen, we configure the details about each event that we want to investigate. Once the monitoring is configured, then we can use this screen to watch live data to see what's going on our SQL Server in real time. We can find extended events within SQL Server Management Studio under Management. Activity Monitor is another graphical, user-friendly monitoring tool. Activity Monitor is extremely useful for monitoring blocking problems and expensive queries on SQL Server. We can use Activity Monitor to do our initial monitoring and troubleshooting. Once we know what the problem might be, then we can use some other monitoring and troubleshooting tools to do more detailed investigation. We can find Activity Monitor on the top menu of SQL Server Management Studio. We use SQL commands for monitoring and troubleshooting very often. In this example, we use the aggregation function count to monitor SQL Server database table sizes. If we have very large tables, for instance, tables that contain 3-4 billion rows, we cannot use count, the regular count function. We need to use count big. Count big will allow us to monitor, to measure extremely large tables. So we want to be aware of those less frequently used monitoring commands. We can also use dynamic management views and dynamic management functions for monitoring and troubleshooting. Dynamic management views and dynamic management functions are generally called dynamic management objects. We can incorporate dynamic management objects in our SQL program to do custom monitoring, and we can program to take actions in response to our monitoring outcome. So dynamic management objects are very flexible and powerful tools for monitoring and troubleshooting. Since it's about SQL programming, so there may be a learning curve. It's better that we start with graphical monitoring tools. Once we feel comfortable with the graphical monitoring tools and the monitoring, then we want to learn about using dynamic management objects for custom and detailed monitoring and troubleshooting. This is an example of using dynamic management objects for monitoring and troubleshooting. We use two dynamic management views here. The first one is DM trend logs, and the second one is DM OS waiting text. As we can see, it's just like regular SQL programming. So we can become very creative. We can create our own custom solutions for monitoring and troubleshooting using SQL programming and dynamic management objects. Information schema is part of the SQL standard. Usually, vendors use information schema for product integration. Database console commands, DBCC commands, have been around forever. Some of the DBCC commands have been replaced by newer tools, but DBCC commands are still very handy tools for ad hoc monitoring and troubleshooting. For instance, we can use DBCC commands to monitor memory utilization and blocking issues. For blocking issues, we usually use DBCC OpenTrend. Standard reports is another graphical tool, very user-friendly yet very powerful. Standard reports are SQL Server reporting services reports. Under the surface, the data for standard reports is compiled by dynamic management objects, extended events, and some other monitoring tools. This is an example. We can use a standard report to monitor the disk utilization of our databases. We can use, as always, a graphical monitoring tool to do our initial investigation. Once we know what the problem might be, then we can use some other tools to do further investigation. We can find standard reports by right-clicking a database, reports, standard reports. Then we see a selection of reports that we can choose from. There are some other useful monitoring and troubleshooting tools. For instance, we can use system stored procedures like SP-Who2. SP-Who2 has been around forever. There are still database professionals using SP-Who2 for ad hoc monitoring and troubleshooting. We can also use the Best Practice Analyzer published by Microsoft. We run the Best Practice Analyzer, and the tool will give us some recommendations about how to make our SQL Server run better. For large database environments, we can use SQL Server Management Pack. SQL Server Management Pack is integrated with SCOM, System Center Operation Manager. It's a very flexible and powerful tool for monitoring large database environments. Lastly, we can buy third-party tools. Generally speaking, third-party tools are very comprehensive. Third-party tools can allow us to monitor our overall database infrastructure. One very common, very popular third-party tool is Spotlight on SQL Server Enterprise, published by Quest Software. This concludes the lecture on monitoring implementation.